take it away. Spackman, Mossop, Michaels.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much for the opportunity to make this presentation this afternoon. And I can see, as the last team, clearly it had better be great. I'm just going to very briefly introduce our team members who are here on the stage. From the left, Maddie Williams, Brad Samuels, Brittany Stoney, Sarah Williams. I'm Elizabeth Mossop, and we have a phantom team member, Brandon Odoms, who is a key team member, who is fine, but unfortunately was in a car accident a couple of days ago, so is only going to be joining us by video. So we're going to start by talking very briefly about Detroit and about this particular moment in time for this project. Then we're going to introduce the team members, and then we'll go into talking about our approach to the project, particularly, and a series of issues to do with the process before it is then thrown open for Q&A. So just to start, I'm going to hand over to Maddie to begin a conversation about this particular moment in Detroit and what we think it means for the project.
Thank you. I'm Matt Williams, and I have a particular perspective about this work because of my background. I think Renaissance is probably the most appropriate word to define the moment that we're in Detroit as we actively reimagine our public spaces in ways that frankly didn't exist when I grew up here. Little background, I am a native of Detroit. I grew up here. I grew up in Rosedale Park. I went to the University of Detroit Jesuit for Academy, and then I went to Renaissance High School, which is still the best high school in the city. I'm sorry if you didn't have the opportunity to go there. It's okay. It's all right. We still love you. You're still great too. So I understand the power of Detroit's creative economy firsthand. As I've traveled and lived in other cities across the world, I've had the opportunity to hone my skills as a business developer, as a community engagement advocate, and as a landscape architect. And it's these unique set of skills that have allowed me to work in communities on projects that really put the culture makers in the driver's seat. And so it's since 2011 that I've dreamt of coming back home and joining the creative economy here in Detroit. Here I find myself, a native Detroiter, in a class of young creative placemakers, working with kids in the Brightmoor community, not far from where I grew up, taking on leadership roles in my church, having an opportunity to take on leadership capacity in the city of Detroit as a historic district commissioner, but most significantly to me, being able to work in my chosen profession as a landscape architect, designing places and spaces for our public realm. Our goal with this project is to remove barriers and create opportunities for all Detroiters to connect and utilize our cultural resources here in the city. And so it's this experience that I believe will result in a much more sustainable Detroit. Thank you.
And so this is emblematic of something which is very important to us in how we think about this project, how it is part of the broader city project, and what is really possible in terms of thinking about greater economic sustainability throughout the community in terms of arts and culture. So, as I said before, we're at this very particular moment in time in this city renaissance. There is so much going on downtown and in the Midtown neighborhood in particular, an enormous amount of change, particularly over the last 5 years. We really have a new picture in terms of urban mobility in this city. We have so many initiatives. We have the Detroit Slow Roll, we have the Joe Louis Greenway, we have the Q Line. And we also have new public spaces in the city being used in new ways. We have Campus Martius, we have the riverfront, We have our own project in the Fitzgerald neighbourhood. And we see here many of the sort of defining places that are part of this district that we're really focused on. And so what is also clear to us is the fact that we have this incredibly strong community. The Detroit community is clearly the definition of urban resilience. We have great institutions, we have powerful community engagement, we have a rich urban history. And we also have a vibrant arts and culture scene across the city. Here are just some fairly recent example. The Alley Project, the Eastern Market murals that Brandon Odom has been involved in. We also have the Fitzgerald mural project you can see here, done with Hubert Massey, and some very recent images of community members involved in the creation of this project. And you can see it here as it is actually being installed on site in Fitzgerald. So these are emblematic of an enormous amount of energy across the city in its arts and cultural space. And here you can also see the sort of the city map and what that shows us in terms of a broader context of art institutions and galleries. So what does this project mean to Detroit? This renewed cultural district could be a focus and engine for arts and culture across the city. These renewed public spaces could tap into the city's social and cultural intelligence in a new way to express its renewed vitality. This district could be a laboratory for what is possible in public spaces with community engagement. And this cultural district could connect all of its great institutions, both to each other and to the rest of the world in new ways. So we're just going to introduce the team in some more detail. And in putting together this team, we've been very focused on how we can most effectively engage with the people and culture of this city. The underlying foundation is, of course, that we have to be able to create beautiful public spaces. But how we do that will be very specific to this city and to this place. So we have an ensemble team focused on connection and engagement and the relationship between cultural activities and public space. The team that you will be introduced to today is our core creative team. The broader project will engage with a wider group of technical and other specialists as the project develops. And you can see the illustration of this idea on the screen. So first of all, we have artist Brandon Odom, or B-Mike, who, as I said before, has worked
About
in
4.5 years ago, I found myself in this abandoned housing project. It was heavily occupied by graffiti writers. I got introduced to graffiti and street art. And so I started coming back out there, trying to duplicate some of the graffiti, and initially I felt like I was no good at the lettering and the traditional styles of graffiti. But then I was like, I used to paint, I used to do portraits. Let me see if I can do what I did with a paintbrush, with a spray can. My name is Brandon B. Odom. I'm a visual artist from New Orleans, and I just put a little paint where it ain't. So we're in the Bywater neighborhood of New Orleans. This is called Studio B. One side of it is open to the public, where my first solo show is on display. And then the other side of it is the space that I create out of. Graffiti has a long history that I respect and appreciate so much. Rule breakers were always associated with something of like a revolutionary thought. But I felt like creating an image of Dr. King in an abandoned housing project was way more effective to me than to paint my name. And that's not to be critical of those who went in that space to paint their names. I just felt like for me and my truth, I felt more of a responsibility to use that moment to break a rule for a reason. And that's when I started to separate stylistically, intentionally with what I saw to be traditional graffiti. These are all like wooden cutouts. These are all people who champion, in my opinion, the idea of their words having power. And so really this was like a way to kind of say, what if Nikki Giovanni was a graffiti writer? Like what type of words would we be confronted with? Or if John Lennon or Malcolm X, like what would we be seeing in the public spaces if these individuals were bombing the streets, as they say? You know, I like the juxtaposition of painting someone like Muhammad Ali and then painting someone right across the room, a regular person from New Orleans, but painting them in the same scale, in the same way. And in a lot of ways, it's to show that there's value in the lionized characters, but then there's value in the everyday person that's existing, that's trying to survive. When I was painting at abandoned projects, New Orleans at the time was speaking about post-Katrina recovery as if everyone who left had the opportunity to return. And all those abandoned spaces, those abandoned apartments and homes should have reminded us that these were families, these were people who lived here that aren't here. Where are they now? Those walls represented a certain narrative that we were trying to bring to the forefront. These are all the original sheetrock walls from that particular project. The Housing Authority of New Orleans, after they threatened to arrest me and made me write this formal letter of apology, they contacted me and said, yo, we're about to demolish that building, but we can cut out all the walls that you painted. It's kind of fascinating to be back here because, so like this was done on 5/19/13, Malcolm X's birthday. This was the first piece that I did out there. And even the technique, like I was using markers for details because I wasn't too confident with like the spray can. We would climb up to the second floor because the first floors were all like destroyed from the water. And we would climb up to the second floor, and this is what it began to look like, where every room just kind of had its own art on it, whether it was done by me or other artists. Then it became like messages like this. Like this was written in 1966. We want decent housing fit for the shelter of human beings, and here we were until 2013. I think this was the last thing I did in that space. This is around the time I was getting in trouble for it, and I was finishing up this piece. And it said, don't let me be misunderstood. It's definitely surprised me where I am now. And I think that's what's so humbling about those walls being in that last room. I would never have imagined that 4.5, 5 years later, that I would be standing here. This being Studio B, the solo show is Ephemeral Eternal. In the idea of ephemeral eternal, it's like taking these ephemeral moments, these temporary moments, and figuring out what connects it to eternity. Like the legacy of Dr. King, who died when he was young, who lived a long time ago, but yet everyone who walked in this building, they know exactly who that is painted on the wall. So there's a part of his life that's ephemeral, but then there's a larger part that's eternal. There's ideas, there's these themes that are eternal. I'm inspired by a legacy where stakes are always too high to just waste time.
So that's B, Mike. The stakes are always too high to waste time. And with that, I'm going to introduce Sarah Williams, who is a coder and urban scientist and director of the Civic Data Design Lab at MIT.
Great. Thanks so much. I'm so excited to be here today to share thoughts. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how our lab operates. The Civic Data Design Lab uses data, technology, and visualization to change urban policies. We do that through a collaborative process, working with stakeholders to engage in algorithm development and technology that's collaborative. We believe that collaborative design is important because it creates trust in the data analytics we produce, but also allows the community to co-own the results we develop. We have projects as far-ranging as this one in Nairobi, where we transformed the chaotic matatu system, which is the informal transit system, into a visualization that looks like something that you would see in New York or Paris or even Detroit. The city made it the official map of the city, and this was all possible by co-developing a program with coders in Nairobi, and so they built the technology with us. We also created a curriculum for New York City's public school that looked at the social justice issues around the lottery. Students became journalists as we created a mobile tool which allowed them to go out into the field and collect stories about whether the lottery was good or bad. The data from these stories went into our mobile device, and many students decided, based on their data analytics, the lottery was a scam. We work in public space quite often. This is a project called Benchmark, where we embedded sensors into street furniture to actually measure how public space was used. One of the things that the lab is really interested in doing is creating interfaces that allow community to interact with both the data and technology and develop their own opinions and ideas from it. Thank you very much.
And Brittany Stoney is a Detroit musician and performer.
Hello, how's everybody doing out there? My name is Brittany Stoney, as she said, and I actually perform at the DIA at least twice a year. It's one of my favorite places to perform, in the Kresge Hall. And I also am a playwright. Shameless plug, if anybody is going to Allied Media Conference this week, check out Stage Reading Sunday at 1 p.m. At Wayne State in the Student Center. Yeah, and I think we're going to play a short video just to show you a little bit more about me and my style of singing and everything. Thank you. Over there, and I choose life over there, to live with no regret.
I am expanding my music into more produced things and electronics, somewhere like electronic soul or electric soul. Mama make her money bartending and serving. Never had to ask for nothing 'cause she hustling and working. Detroit, molded me, and it just made me into this really versatile person, I'm forever a songwriter, so I can write in all types of levels. Yeah, but trust me, it's all love, never a competition. If we got the same mission, only to reach the youth when you doing what you do.
Okay, so C2 is an unconventional architecture practice that uses design, research, and fabrication for creative and social impact. And what you're looking at is a kind of montage mashup that hopefully gives you an insight a little bit into our process. We're unusual in the sense that we have both a fabrication shop and a design practice, which we operate in parallel, and it allows us to work in somewhat unconventional ways. I'd say the more traditional way of practicing architecture might be more linear. You might start with a sketch, move to a scale model, draft something, and then if you're lucky, you might send it out for a prototype. We have the benefit of being able to build things, and that allows us to kind of test ideas and prove concepts, and that's great, but that's not really the true value. The true value and the real idea between the shop and the studio is to kind of erase the boundaries between thinking and making, and to really allow ourselves in the creative process to have the full spectrum of options in front of us. So we might begin a project early on by looking at material samples, building at full scale, prototyping. And this idea of prototyping is something I think is really potentially relevant to this project. The idea that early and quick, we want to get ideas built and put out into the world, and that there can be an iterative process that allows us to refine our design ideas and our design thinking with feedback from the community, with feedback from stakeholders. So when we go and make final decisions, they're good decisions. I think that happens all the time in software, right? User testing. It should happen in architecture as well. So we're big sort of promoters of that idea.
So, finally, Spackman, Mossop, Michaels. We are landscape architects and urbanists who specialize in the design of public space. We design beautiful urban spaces. We're also specialists in urban mobility and sustainability. And we also know how to work effectively with Detroit communities. We have a studio here in Detroit, and we've been working here since 2015. So we're relative newcomers to the city, and we've been very fortunate to work with wonderful partners in Detroit over the last few years, collaborating with DCDC on a number of projects, and also with many other local professionals. So you see here a range of public spaces that we have designed, many of which involve collaboration with artists. And this is one of our projects currently under construction in downtown Chattanooga, involving the reinvention of a series of outmoded public spaces. In Detroit, we're committed to working with communities in the co-creation of urban places that support economic vitality, social equity, and ecological sustainability. We're currently working on a number of projects. You see here what is currently happening in the Fitzgerald neighborhood, where we're doing one of the first pilots to make a blight-free neighborhood. And this involves a complicated collaboration with the city of Detroit, and also a number of strategies that are really focused on quick and flexible ways to make different types of public space. So I think our experience is unique in this, in that we appreciate what it takes to make inventive design propositions, to co-create strategies with local communities, and also to bring them to implementation in what can often be a very challenging environment. And with that, I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about the way that we are thinking about this design project. So, if we look at this existing cultural district, we're seeing these three big issues. The streets are barriers that are killing public life. And I think really you see these images speak for themselves. The opportunity is here to do more, to bring the arts, culture, science, history outside the institutions and into the public space. And we can see some of this in the image here outside the Charles H. Wright, and a range of the public sculptures that already sit within the district. So we're looking to the streets as a major vehicle for reframing the district. First of all, we have the mighty Woodward Avenue. Currently, it's a major thoroughfare, but it has the potential to be a magnificent urban boulevard. The second idea is to take the cross streets from the district that currently carry little traffic, in many cases operating as driveways to their adjacent institutions. So they offer a major opportunity to be reinvented, both as beautiful streets, but also as spaces that can be largely devoted to different types of art interventions and programs. The through streets carry more traffic, but they can also be civilized and slowed as they pass through the district with the use of urban tree planting and opportunities for art interventions there as well. Then we have the district edges. Again, trees and materials can be used to identify the thresholds of the district. There are opportunities on Woodward. Interventions at gateway points can frame the district and reinforce its urban presence. And then there are a series of a number of substantial green spaces within the district that will provide opportunities for informal inhabitation and activation. And then finally, the opportunity, the monumental access that connects the DIA and the library provides the opportunity for a great urban square and plazas across Woodward, signalling again the district and its role in the city and providing a monumental public space. So that is the framework. So that is the idea of an underlying approach to how this whole district might work and how it might be given a new structure. So then we have to think about what are the opportunities for how that might be brought to life. And this is a whole series. These are ideas. They illustrate our design approach and our thinking. Obviously, at this stage in the process, these are just snapshots. They definitely come from our shared vision about the project, but they are very far from being integrated as thoughtful design propositions, which have to come from a future engagement process. So this is the idea about these plazas and how we might connect the interior of the institutions to the exterior in terms of thinking of ways to further extend interior program into exterior spaces. And so the question is, then we have this architecture, this framework for the district. How is that brought to life? So we as landscape architects are focused on the framework, thinking about natural processes, thinking about water management, thinking about plants and biodiversity, and thinking about seasonal events. So obviously we look at the creation of these public spaces. We think about how they can be part of water storage, water management. We think about how all of the planted areas can contribute to ideas about biodiversity and about habitat. And you can see here some illustrations of soil cells underground to store water, of a biodiverse planting, and also the opportunity to really think about strategies that are going to bring major seasonal events to the district. So now, in the absence of Brandon, I am going to show you a brief video that he made and then talk through some of his key ideas, and so that you can see these relate to this idea of the art streets and street art, and also public sculpture.
Peace, this is Brandon B. Mike Odom. My apologies, I could not be there in the flesh, but I'm really excited about this opportunity. I feel as though public art is such a powerful and inspiring and informative tool. And I think that the beautiful thing about it is the fact that the word public is in that phrase, that for public artists, you have to deal with and think about and collaborate with the public in the public spaces. So I feel like within that is an opportunity to not only highlight the histories of the spaces or highlight the histories of the people within those spaces, but it's an opportunity to collaborate all those stories together. Art should not help delete a space, but art should amplify a space. It should amplify the stories, the narratives, and the histories of the spaces as is.
So the idea that he has been developing is that these art streets form a venue for collaboration between their adjacent institutions. For example, here, the DIA, the Hellenic Museum, form a partnership. Each one of these streets is animated by a series of programs or residencies that come out of shared institutional programs. And so the idea is that gradually that these institutions work together to populate the streets with content that is driving particular art programs and residencies over time. And so we start to see how the art streets themselves begin to be this really animating structure throughout the district. The form that this could take is obviously dependent on the way that these residencies and that these programs are then conceived by the institutions that are involved. And then the idea is also that there is a relationship between this project as a centralizing venue and then how that relationships are formed between the programs that happen here and other organizations and other programs throughout the city, so that we start to develop these reciprocal relationships that allows this to be an engine to really drive this art and cultural activity across the city and in the neighborhoods. And now Sarah is going to talk to us.
So when our team got together and we were thinking about how do we create a new cultural infrastructure for the city, and what does infrastructure mean on the streets, I started to think about the fact that 40% of Detroit's residents do not have internet. And I thought, how could we use this project to kind of tip the scale and create a kind of cultural infrastructure for the city? So let me start by saying, why is it that only so few people in Detroit have access to the internet? And that really comes from the way internet is distributed. So for telecoms, it's most efficient to have a centralized system. Most networks work that way. You have a kind of centralized system and it's distributed out from that location. But in Detroit, infrastructure has become much more decentralized. There are parts of the city fabric that have been broken, and getting internet in this way is not possible in this centralized system. And so, a distributed system of internet makes a lot more sense. And there are examples in Detroit of distributed internet. In fact, the Detroit Community Technology Project has started to create something called wireless mesh networks, which allow us to have one access point for internet, and a series of antennas are distributed throughout the community to give open access to internet everywhere in that community. So let's just see, how does this work in real life? I'm going to do a demonstration just so you guys can all understand. We are going to create our own wireless meshwork here in this room. You guys ready? All right. You, sir, in the hat, you are a node. Please stand up. All right. You, sir, in the pink back there, you're another node. Is that pink? You can tell me if I'm the wrong color, but yes, you have identified yourself. You are a node on the internet. You are a node. What color is it, sir? Orange, sorry. See, I might be colorblind. Okay. Over here in the orange, you are a node on the internet. And here in the yellow, you are another node. And how about way back there, the gray shirt, sitting, you who are looking behind you? Yes, I'm talking about you. All right, so what happens with a distributed system is that you create centralized nodes, and then all of the people sitting down, your antennas. And you're actually facilitating the distribution from these nodes. And what really happens here is you can create a strength in the network. So if that yellow person has to sit down, the system will still function through the antennas. It might be a little bit weaker, but it will still function through the antennas between our sir in orange and our person in the hat. And so this makes a stronger network, and really is something that we've been experimenting a lot as we become much more decentralized. And so communities, each one of you are communities, and you can own the internet, and you can own what you produce on it. And so this is what gets us to our project. You can all sit down, internet nodes. Yeah. Okay. So the project is really to use the site as a prototype for creating a wireless mesh network. The infrastructure of the mesh network can be art, it can be embedded in benches, it can be embedded into different kinds of artwork. Because the mesh network is owned by the cultural community, you can put anything on it. So the whole collection of the DIA can be in that network, and the community can create their own experience moving through the museum. We can have community-led exhibitions that are curated on the fly and projected onto the screen. And because there'll be data available across the site, we can create much more responsive art and architecture. So example here is on site. You can come on with your cell phone. You can have access to outside of the museum to the many digital collections. You can read about that, and you can project it perhaps even on screens on the site to create your own version of the DIA. The technology also allows us to create digital art and responsive art that records what's happening on the site itself. The idea is that we connect this node, mesh node here, with mesh nodes that are already being developed across the city. And as we mentioned, the Allied Media Conference is being held this week, and they're really promoting this idea. And we would really hope to work with them on this project in some of their existing work. And access to the internet will really help many of those underserved communities. We hope it gives freedom from the telecoms by giving community ownership over the internet. And one of the great things about what the Detroit Community Technology Project is doing is it's really teaching the community skills about building this technology. And it facilitates cultural programs that can be outside the DAA. So if we have a mesh network in another neighborhood, that can be then distributed digitally. Here is an example from the Detroit Community Technology Project of planning this network and actually installing it in an area in Detroit and distributing digital technologies. So I really hope that we can co-build technology in Detroit that is cultural in nature and it's a prototype on the museum. Thank you.
All right, I got the easy part here. So Detroit is known for its musical culture, and it is filled with many talented artists. But there are not many platforms that showcase this, and that's coming from somebody that got their start with open mics. Every night I would go to an open mic and eventually got picked up for shows and gigs and stuff. We want to activate the space with informal gatherings and a much more grassroots way of bringing the community together. Something like a jam session that would take place in a grassier area of the DIA, a living room set up with couches and rugs, create an inviting space and an interactive area for all. A place that the public can connect with Detroit's raw talent. So basically, a host would help coordinate and bring together a different artist within their network, and then they would produce an impromptu showcase. So of course, Detroit's youth would be involved. We would take high schoolers and let them be hosts and bring together their own musicians and have their own jam session. We want to infuse vibrancy in the district with something that's more malleable than constructive. There's something very engaging about a group of artists coming together and creating something that's on the spot. So we want to bring more life and more of that Detroit spirit to the area. This is just one of the many ideas. We also want to do a night market, more traditional showcases in front of large murals, like a storytelling collaboration, basically saying, what does this mural or painting sound like? These are all just the beginning of what is sure to be the growth of the city's cultural roots. Thank you.
Okay. We often think about architecture as static and kind of unchanging, but I think we can all agree that the cities are constantly changing. Certainly Detroit is, and we're living through a moment of fundamental change across industries, whether we're talking about transportation or logistics. Things are changing quickly, and I think the question we want to ask is, what does that mean for architecture? Is there such a thing as a flexible architecture? Just by way of introduction, a few projects that I think are particularly relevant that we've done recently. This is a pavilion that we did for the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory. It's in construction documents, and it's relevant because this is a campus that was designed in the 1960s. It feels very dated, more dated than campuses that are much older, and it doesn't really reflect the kind of innovative culture that JPL really is. So this project is really about realigning the sense of place and the placemaking with what's actually happening on site. This is another project we did called the Solar Canopy Project, where we designed a sort of prototype for canopies that provide solar power to 1- and 2-family homes across New York City. And this is really leveraging our fabrication capabilities as a way to investigate quickly deployable, sustainable components. And this is proliferated all across the boroughs at this point. Here, another idea of a kind of tactical approach to architecture, a flexible approach. This is a kind of kiosk that was designed for a food company and piloted in Times Square, studied and understood and sort of fabricated in our shop, but also something which is highly flexible and mobile. So how does it aggregate, get redeployed, and live in other parts of the city at different times? It's not something that's static. And then finally, a project which I think is particularly relevant to the DIA. This is something we did for the Brooklyn Museum, and the brief here was how to rethink the visitor experience. And so what they had was a really active, vibrant public space on outside the museum, but none of that, or very little of it, was actually making its way into the institution. So we were engaged to think about signage, wayfinding, furniture, ways to bring that activity and force inside, and to kind of erase the barrier that was there, somehow a very strong barrier between the institutional reality and the kind of public space outside. And it is really, sort of really interesting to see what caffeine and power and reprogramming space does. It was you know, really active and changing constantly. And that's another big part of this idea, is that, you know, these are spaces that are constantly changing. The museum had a huge appetite for flexibility, and that's important. Here, I just want to point out that this was also a Beaux-Arts museum designed by McKimmey and White in the turn of the century, and I think reminds me a lot of this opportunity here. So a kind of, you know, large institution on a plinth. How do you begin to erase the boundary between what's happening inside and outside? And I think you all are certainly already doing that in a lot of interesting and important ways. Just to look at the events on the website indicate that very clearly, but also really notable that they're really, they're categorized in two categories, right? In the museum and in the community. And I think it's that second category that we're really interested in focusing on. How do we make that even more robust? There's already a lot of interesting things going on. How do we begin to take that, C as community, M as museum, and really kind of blow it up, really expand that idea of programming to the outside. So there's that boundary between, what is inside and what is outside is blurred. And so this is just the first pass. This is a kind of idea of programming which would really be refined and come out of the engagement process. But these are just ideas for what could happen across the DIA site. A kind of menu, a la carte approach, which we then think about in terms of technical and functional requirements. What do you need to sort of deliver any of those programs, either in isolation or in combination? And so that sort of process allows us to begin to think about components, or a kit of parts is what we're proposing here, at a series of scales. So here, could you imagine pavilions that perhaps are aligned with programs that I just identified and serve certain technical and functional requirements, maker spaces tapping into the kind of rich legacy of manufacturing in Detroit, thinking about its history, but also looking forward, what is the future of manufacturing? Modules, things that are extensible and changeable. Could this provide shade and provide surfaces for Brandon's work and the things he'll curate? And seating, places to stay and spend time. To Brittany's point, places to have jam sessions. And these are all ideas that would be able to kind of reconfigure and rotate and change over time. And part of this is deferring the decision making. We don't want to come into this purporting to know what should be here. Part of this is about prototyping these ideas and exploring them and getting the feedback in communities in real time. And so here, just a first pass, looking at where these might sit on the site, provisionally, as this sort of larger scale, and then the more flexible scale. The idea is that these things would change and move throughout the year. And then one, I think, really important point that Elizabeth touched on already is this idea of the space in between. This tremendous kind of cultural district has all of these really amazing institutions, and there's physically, geographically space in between them to occupy and to program. I also want to suggest that the space in between is a conceptual driver of this project. I think every institution is asking fundamental questions about identity. What is a library at this point? What is an art museum? What is a museum of history? And so the space in between, I think, also becomes a place of interdisciplinary speculation. And in some sense, that's the huge potential I think we see in this district. How does the programming support that investigation? And then also, and finally, I think we'll end on this, how does the amazing work that happens here in this kind of cultural hub get redistributed, not only live here, not only attract people here, but then get redeployed back into the neighborhoods throughout Detroit? And I think that is the last slide, and we're going to take questions.
Okay, thank you. We're going to start with the jury and introductions of the jury.
Thank you, Felicia, and thank you for the presentation. I think the jury would like to introduce themselves, and then after that we can start with the round of questions. My name is Salvador Salord. I am the director of the DIA.
Hi, I'm Rick Rogers, president of the College for Creative Studies.
Juanita Moore, president of the Charles H. Wright Museum.
I'm Julie Bardman. I'm founder and principal of Dirt Studio and professor of landscape architecture at the University of Virginia.
I'm Maurice Cox, director of planning and development for the great city of Detroit.
Good afternoon. I'm Kara McCarty, director of curatorial, Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum.
Mario Moore, a visual artist born and raised in Detroit, who went to Cass Tech, which is better than Renaissance. But I'm based in Brooklyn.
I'll take my own. Yeah, okay. My name is William Gilchrist. I'm the director of planning and building of the home of the 2018 NBA champions.
And I'm Jonathan Massey, Dean at the A. Alfred Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan.
That's it? That's it? Okay, first question.
And I do have a question, if I'll just jump in. I'd like to understand how you see the relationship between a strong emphasis in your presentation on emergent form finding and solution finding through urban prototyping and through civic data, which promise to show us topographies of possibility that are that may be quite contrary to the legacy ordering system of our buildings, streets, landscapes, and lawns, versus the highly classically ordered framework, Elizabeth, that you modeled. And I understand that we're not at design solutions yet, but I feel like there's an underlying strong difference between your approach, which is kind of permanent, like centuries-old ordering strategies, and a kind of permaculture of geometric formal ordering strategies, versus the concept of emergence. Do the emergent things just kind of wash over the permanent classical ordering, or would we imagine that the ordering system, the permanent stuff would emerge and be radically asymmetrical and unevenly distributed?
I'll answer that briefly, and then I'll hand over to Brad to talk about it a little bit more. I guess we see that, the sort of the strong geometry and the sort of classical ordering coming out of the history of the site. It gives us a really important starting point. It allows us to be in dialogue with the existing architecture, and it allows us to think about the legacy that we have on the site, particularly of mature trees and canopy. And then there's this very interesting possibility about the relationship between that and a new order, because we're really interested in this idea about sort of from the 19th century to straight to the 21st century in a way. And I think we're very interested in what that relationship is and what the possibility might be for the emergent forms to then inflect the other order. I don't see it testing to the point of destruction, but I think the exploration of that relationship from a design perspective is going to be one of the key driving things that allows us to make decisions.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a tension there, but I would argue it's a really productive tension. I think the strength of this site in some sense is the monumentality, right? But I think the monumentality needs to be supplemented with a kind of magnetism, a way to kind of distribute activity around the site. I went and spoke to a small business owner yesterday who is literally 400 feet away from the entrance and doesn't have the kind of foot traffic to her small cafe. And so for me, that indicated that people might be coming to the museum in cars, having an experience and just leaving. I think the question of how to begin to distribute and to begin to test how to program the space in between becomes really important and not complementary in a way to the kind of infrastructure that's already there.
I would love to hear a little bit about how you would engage the staff who work within the different institutions, because what you're talking about is quite curated outside, but how do you, and you're talking about bringing some of what's inside out, but how would you engage the staff in the institutions?
This is really a sort of a crucial building block of this whole approach, because we see the opportunity for these processes also to perhaps drive new activities and new collaborative activities between these institutions that could be profoundly, has the potential in some ways to be profoundly transformational. So we're interested partly in the expression of these institutions in this exterior landscape, but then we're also interested in these processes about what happens when you use this as a vehicle for the institutions to form different relationships. So it's part of, a pretty complicated strategy in terms of engagement generally, but I would see that a big piece of that would be the sort of investigations that would take place with stakeholders through interviews, through focus groups, looking for help from the institutions in terms of how best to structure and engage those conversations.
I just want to add that, if you think about the demonstration in the room, each one of the institutions is one of those nodes, and they will be helping us curate that kind of digital infrastructure. And through that process of talking to them about what they want to curate, what they want to see, we're going to learn about them as a community. Each node here on the site replicates the way we see the community nodes as well. And so the network should be distributed, and it should work together in that way, and that they have ownership of the material that they provide towards us.
All right, thanks. I'd like to jump in. And first of all, Elizabeth, it's wonderful to see you. And I just want to tell you how much I've missed the Louisiana accent. It's great. I wanted to ask, and this is actually a very good diagram or image, I guess, to beg the question. When I look at the process that you are representing, that your network portends, in terms of getting information from the community about how they might vision what they see their stake in this. And I look at this open space opportunity we have at the scale of the city. And if we were to do a figure ground of what's open, what's available, what's public, what's common, where might we see the obligation or the fulfillment of this space around these institutions perhaps reach to meet a need that's unmet elsewhere in the city? So if you thought about a city in terms of its network of parks, name any city you want to, think of Boston, think of New York, do the figure ground and see where those spaces are, what the different characteristics are, or Chicago. And if we were to do it here, I'm wondering how your process contemplates making this space a space that may be found nowhere else in the city. How's that programmed? Because I appreciate the response you gave to Jonathan's question, but the concern I have a little bit with what I saw you represent in terms of physical form, it has a feeling of incrementalism, and I get that sense of it, and I get the idea of continuity of experience. But the challenge sometimes is when things are so incremental, particularly when you're trying to make counterpoint to something this huge, that the idea of the grand statement, the grand vision, the big move of what this space could be in the context of the city may get lost. And I'd just like to get a feel for how you are thinking about that. And especially with that community engagement process that your technology might bring.
There are sort of two parts to that, I think. One is that we see the opportunity very strongly for this district to be a focal point and a catalyst for the city more broadly, so that the sort of piloting of ideas about new technology and the acquisition of skills and capability around that is something that can be tested and piloted here, that can then enrich communities throughout the city. Physically, there might well be a relationship between art interventions or different types of constructions that may go on to a life elsewhere in the city, depending on the community relationships that generate that. So that's very much part of this thinking. Mm-hmm. You are certainly, a lot of the imagery that you're seeing here currently is about these sort of layers and incremental ideas. It does not mean that that is what would necessarily come out of the design process. We're just trying not to prejudge the formal strategies at this point. There are clearly enormous formal opportunities here. We have these powerful monumental architecture, we have major axes, we have real concentrations of interest, around particular institutional content and those sorts of things. So that the early stages of the design process may well generate very strong formal ideas. I still think in terms of approach, we are thinking very much about about spaces that will allow flexibility and change over time, but it doesn't then necessarily follow that those spaces themselves are without formal power.
So, I think my point was not to sort of evangelize about the future flexibility of everything. I think just as important is to say what can be flexible and what should not be flexible, right? And I think what we're putting forward is a kind of process that Kit of Parts was really thought about as process. We could build and implement some of that quickly as part of the schematic design process even. We've done that. And so if the appetite is there to get feedback from stakeholders institutionally and in the community, that we've seen a real power in interacting with physical space that is not the same as pure sort of theoretical projections. And so that's the kind of process we imagine getting us to major design decisions that have big capital implications.
I'd like, well, first of all, thank you for tipping your hat a little and showing us your thought process so that we can get to the heart of how you might approach this if you were given the opportunity. So there's obviously a great risk, but I think it's a risk worth taking, and I'm glad you took it. There are a couple of things, and I think Elizabeth began to address this. We are building something for a century, for 100 years. I assure you we will not be here 20 years redoing this. So we still live with the legacy of Saarinen on the Detroit riverfront. We are literally dealing with his legacy today. So I'm just trying to understand what is the legacy that you'll be creating? What's the formal manifestation in your minds? Because the ephemeral will disappear, right? We might actually lose interest in the pop-up even 10 years from now. And so I want to understand, what do you think are going to be the things that remain that 50 years from now people will saying they fundamentally changed the order of that space?
So I think that this really comes to these ideas about finding the means to reorder this district. And so that is in part, about the physical relationships between the buildings, ideas about scale, ideas about how to make these connections, and also ways of reordering the space so that it is less an absence of things between the buildings and is more about making connections and about creating much more positive spaces. So that I see, we've talked a little bit about what might drive that framework, so that's certainly not all that would drive it. I also think that a part of that is this idea about the expression of the institutions in the exterior landscape, because I see that as being more than ephemeral. While it might be expressed through different programs, I think that the reordering, there is a great potential in terms of changing the way, the relationship between the interior and the exterior of some of these institutions. We don't know anything at this point about what the form of that might be, because that has to come out of a very close conversation with the institutions. So that, the first thing to do would be to really be in those conversations to test what might be possible. But that, to me, seems to potentially be a really powerful reordering device. And I think we're also conscious of the opportunity to really create major, iconic public spaces. How that is done is to some extent, going to come out of these processes, or whether we are thinking about sculptural means, whether we are working with water. We're very clear about the opportunity to provide a very different kind of environment in this district through tree planting, which to me seems like a clear underlying idea. And again, obviously, the form of that then is a big part of the opportunity for how these iconic spaces get made.
So I wanted to ask, and I'm hoping one of you can answer, because I know B. Mike is not here, and I like what he's doing, and I appreciate what he's doing. But in the presentation, it seemed like a monolithic B. Mike type of thing all around. So I'm wondering where a space is for local artists or international artists grouped together, thinking in the short term and long term placement and how that exists, and it not just be this one artist that has, you know, these spaces.
The sort of the monolithic idea presumably really came out of that initial video, which is really just more about his track record and his interests. We've had a lot of conversation around this question, and he's very focused on a couple of different things. One is that this idea about this Art Streets program, his idea is that is the opportunity that brings together both local artists and international artists. And the idea is that is then co-created through collaborations between these different institutions. He's also very interested in thinking about what other programs can support that idea, can support the activities that the DIA already undertakes, the festivals that already exist, to be really focused on what are the opportunities to help to help people who are involved in the arts in Detroit find a more sustainable ways of making a living. So that's another idea that sort of underpins this idea about a whole range of different programs and how that then ties in with ideas about markets or ideas about international tourism or whatever it is. But it's very much this idea that you try to set up a framework that can bring together these two networks, one of people who are local and regional, and one of people who are internationally, potentially connected through the DIA. Yeah. So that's, pretend that Brandon just said that.
Oh, I was just saying that, so I understand, like, it wasn't about the video, it was more about just the kind of landscape presentation where you had the little spots and it all kind of centered on, like, B Mike, so that's what I was talking about.
I think we're going to have some time for audience questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please step up to either one of the mics. Do we have any questions? If not, we'll keep going with the jury. Okay.
Hello, I'm a resident of the area, and I had two questions. One was, you showed the idea very abstractly of bridging Woodward and turning that into a public square. That's a very interesting idea. I don't know if you could elaborate concretely how that might be done. And the other question is, this seems more driven towards attracting visitors, and I wonder how you expect residents in the area to interact with these ephemeral landscapes. Thank you.
I can speak to the residents interacting with the area. With those, like the jam sessions I was saying, we will be, well, there's so many micro communities within the art community. So we will be pulling from all of these different art communities to have a different host every other week or so to work within their network and pull together musicians and artists. And that alone, I feel like, will bring out residents because, like I said, that's very engaging to see artists coming together, collaborating together, storytelling together. That space would just automatically bring residents out because it's very inviting. like I said, with the living room setup and the couches and the rugs. It's gonna invite and welcome everyone.
Just to touch on the piece about the Woodward space being transformed into more of a plaza area, I think the precedent here in our city is right outside of the Coleman A. Young Municipal Center, where our illustrious planner, Maurice Cox, has turned that into a plaza, which was at first maybe uncharacteristic of Detroit, to cut off one of the major arteries of the city, but now it's a really warm and welcome public space for people to visit. Maybe our idea isn't for a formal and permanent reimagination of Woodward as a public plaza, but something that certainly could be programmed as such for events.
So I thought maybe somebody in the public had another question.
Yeah, go.
But I'm thinking about that.
You can go, no.
Okay.
Good.
About that plaza that's at the end, because it's right at the end when you get to Jefferson, where there's a stop. So when you think about something so historic as a thoroughfare like Woodward that takes you all the way to the suburbs, I think the plaza is great, but I think there needs to be a capacity to go through that and not go around. So I know it's like a risk to put something out there like that you did, but that's just something to think about, because I think that would be a very big problem.
Oh, there is no question that there will be traffic going through Woodward. And the question about how that would be achieved, the answer is with great difficulty, I suspect, because I'm pretty sure it involves federal, state, and local authorities. And so these are projects that have significant time frames and require the best of everybody's negotiation skills. But I believe that there's enormous amount to be gained from that kind of approach, and that would have tremendous symbolic power, I believe.
So since several of you live here, I'm just wondering, what is the biggest challenge for you about this project?
It's great that I don't have to actually have the answer, but to describe the challenge is no problem. These are institutions which we come into and draw what is inside of them for inspiration. And I think the largest challenge is to reimagine an experience that all Detroiters can take part of, bringing what's inside of a museum or a cultural institution of any sort around this district and making it something that is public affair. There are unspoken barriers. I think we've talked and danced around what those barriers might be, but maybe 80% of the city of Detroit is Black, and I'm not sure that that's reflected in the attendance rates of any of the institutions here. Mm-hmm. That's an exciting challenge for me to be a part of.
Yeah, I'm actually gonna back off what you said and just kind of bringing the community out, getting them out to these events and to these public spaces and making them feel comfortable, like they belong there as well. You know, it's not just for people who have been here for the last 5 years, but people who have been here for their whole lives, you know, people who have raised their children here and their grandparents are here, that they can come out and be comfortable. So I think that may be a challenge, because we have to figure out the avenues to reach these people other than Facebook events and, you know, right, or whatever. So we have to figure out how we can go in these communities and actually get these people to come out and inform them.
So no, that's critical. That's absolutely essential. And it ties in, thanks, it ties in, I think, to, again, points that all of you are making, but you're bringing this technology, and I'm still trying to understand exactly what it is that distinguishes it as a tool of potential to help us get with all of this. Because I really did want to hear a little bit more of how we're going to engage, and you started asserting the importance. You've got a tool that I'd like to understand how it helps us get to the engaging. It's when they upload the data, but there's experience, there's a feel, an attitude that people have about the community, And it seems like there's a tool here that you could use to capture towards some benefit of
Exactly.
program and what that space might be.
And Bill, I wanna add to that, because it's like, that's why I was jumping at the mic, because I know we had the same question.
That's right.
This is a competition. And so you will be judged by what you deliver 6 months from now. So a lot of the engagement that you describe is like once you win and you put the programs in place. But I'm wondering, how are you going to engage as a team over the next 6 months of this project? I mean, I'm trying to understand your working methodology that will allow you to take this really interesting assortment of players that will somehow infect what you do. I still can't imagine how you're going to do it, but I suspect you've thought about it.
Do you want me to take the technology question first, and it kind of relates? I think it relates.
Bring it on.
So, in many ways, the mesh network I described is rhetorical in nature, in that we should work as a distributed network. Our community should operate in a way where we can create a base and then connect to other bases. And I think in many ways, the mesh network allows that to happen in this kind of very infrastructure way. But I think the process that we're talking about, it also exists in that way. And so communities can curate their own material. The network allows them, helps them to do that, helps to upload and curate their own art, music, and it exists on their network. They can connect to other networks if they want to. It's up to them. It's their network. But the idea is to bring that curation and to bring that kind of distributed way of thinking to the process that we're working in. And so I would really hope that we create those nodes here on the site. Each one of the cultural institutions is a community that has that kind of upload their information and allow the community to engage with them. But those nodes exist throughout Detroit as well, and they can begin to upload the information. I think also, I just want to say this was really an inspiration that came to me from Detroit. This mesh network idea has been the most developed here in the city. It has really become, in the technology community, something that's thought about not just in Detroit, but in places I go to in Africa, in Nairobi. It's being considered as a way to provide internet in a more distributed, less centralized way, and be really radical about the way that we think about connections in space, and kind of less centralized and more distributed. And so, when thinking about how Detroit created this kind of mesh through its strong community ties and was able to give people internet, those strong community ties work in the same way in cultural institutions.
I don't know that we would wait 8 months to start asking questions. I mean, I think the really robust community engagement begins after you've really been engaged as a team, and the kind of quantifiable results of that is more than we have time for. But to begin to have conversations with key stakeholders and community organizations that are anecdotally even proxies for real issues, I think we want to be relevant. We don't want to miss the mark, ask the right questions. So I think we would start those conversations early, and we would probably make that part of our thinking in the next phase if we advanced.
I just want to say 10 minutes, you can keep going with questions or wrap. Okay.
I'll just finish up by sort of not answering that question. Because I think this is one of the most challenging things for what happens in this next phase, because obviously you don't have the capacity to do the real consultation. So that you're going to have to make judgments about what you know and what you don't know. There's going to be a certain amount of speculation, and we're going to be building from networks that we already have and conversations that we are already in, and the opportunities that we can make to have preliminary conversations with some of those key people, and use that as a vehicle really to speculate about what is possible. So with that, I do want to just take the opportunity here at the end to try to tie things together. So this is very much, this sort of came out of the document that we were given. This is very much in the forefront of our thinking as we really approach thinking about this district. What we're proposing is to connect the Detroit Institute of Arts and the surrounding cultural institutions to all the people of Detroit and the broader global community in a new way. And what I'm going to do is just ask each of our panel members to make a summary comment. We might start.
So I think when I think about this project, we are using phrases like barrier, legacy, and connectivity. And, well, first, I'd be remiss if I didn't credit my father, who is the half as good looking but more modest gentleman in the middle of the room, who exposed me to the DIA and to the Science Center with the bright light tunnel that transformed your idea of even being in Detroit to all of a sudden, I was in a spaceship. I don't know about you, but I was in a spaceship every time I went to the Science Center, right? And to the Charles Wright Museum, and having very candid conversations at the dinner table about what our history and legacy meant. And I took it for granted that this is not the experience, or take it for granted that this is not the experience of all Detroiters. And so I think the really true exciting piece of this project is removing said barriers and creating a legacy of Detroiters that, yes, can travel the world and radiate out from the center like spokes on a wheel, but then coming back and being connected to the site and to the space and bringing back the energy and vitality that we've gained and received elsewhere. I think that's the true power and potential of this project.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the major goal for us here is really about accessibility and relevance. And in architectural terms and urban terms, I think it's really about that hard barrier that we want to erase between what's happening inside and what's happening outside to make that much less of an obstacle.
I would just say, as a real Detroiter, I'm just excited to be a part of the future of Detroit and that process, and actually going out and talking to the youth and getting them more involved and to be a part of the future here as well. So.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that my lab really believes in is that you really have to co-build technology. And all of our projects, in Nairobi, New York City, we built the technology in the place so that after I'm gone, those skills stay. And I think that's something that I really want to emphasize here. We can build an interactive display, we can build different ways to engage the digital media, but that should be built with the community. And this is the kind of processes that I really want to encourage here. The mesh network is kind of this rhetorical aspect of that, but how do we create community engagement while also creating skills that would allow people to maintain that infrastructure over time to make it that infrastructure that lasts for 100 years.
So, all of that said, the interesting thing about this project is really so many of the key building blocks exist already. There are world-class cultural institutions, one of the greatest art collections in the United States. There's a critical mass of museums and educational institutions in close proximity. There's already a range of existing festival and events to build on. We're here in the very vibrant Midtown district, so many new businesses, new development. There are already strong connections to local communities, and the city is committed to a new vision for Detroit. So what's missing, and what we believe can be created through this process, are the infrastructure of activated public spaces to connect the institutions into a vibrant cultural district, iconic public spaces as the gateway to the DIA. It's really important, I think, to think about a coherent and integrated circulation strategy, pedestrians, transit, parking, bicycles, to make this district hyper-accessible to everybody. We can have spaces that are designed to foster and support inhabitation by programs of formal and informal events, shelter, technology, flexibility, lighting, and particularly, as I mentioned before, a focus on economic sustainability for the creative arts in Detroit. And through our work, design processes and a program of events to connect this precinct to the life of the city. Existing communities, education, arts and cultural organisations, a venue to connect them to both the Detroit and to the world community. So we think we can use these methods to break down the barriers to these cultural institutions through our processes of both engagement and design. We can make a new cultural infrastructure for a connected Detroit. Thank you.
Thank you to the team. Thanks for coming from far and wide to join us today. Thank you to the jury. Just a few housekeeping things to the jury. We have a meeting in the green room before you disperse. And thank you everyone for joining us over the last 2 days. Stay tuned for the news to come.